9 years ago, we conceptualized the International Colloquium on Black Males in Education while writing a research paper on male academic underachievement across the globe. In doing so, we were struck by the common set of challenges and outcomes for Black males in education globally. Jokingly, we asked each other the question, how robust the discussion would be if we assembled all of the researchers from across the world whose work we just reviewed in one room, fueled by the question, how do we change the educational experience and trajectory for Black males? Through grant support from the World Universities Network, we were able to transform the idea into a social innovation platform designed to embolden the educational experiences of Black males across the globe by utilizing high-quality research and policy recommendations. Historically, ICBME served as a space to exchange ideas and perspectives concerning the global dynamics of Black males in the educational pipeline. It has been a community-building experience that brings together world-class researchers, high-impact practitioners, policymakers, funders, students, and concerned citizens. Typically, the colloquium offers a diverse array of programs, along with 2 days of robust programming prior to the colloquium that serve to elicit intellectual thought, discussion, ideas that can be implemented to serve and improve the experiences of Black males throughout the world. Like many of you, the current state of affairs in the United States and across the globe has captured our attention and changed our daily lives. We were set to stage the 2020 ICBME in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. Then COVID-19 changed the way the world functioned and halted travel. In response, we canceled the in-person convening of ICBME. After much deliberation, we decided to take it virtual. What you should expect from the 2020 virtual ICBME. First, to be clear, the virtual colloquium is very different from our in-person gatherings. We will not have research paper or panel sessions this year. Second, instead of a 3 to 5 day experience, depending on whether you participated in the pre-colloquium or not, we have right-sized our experience to less than 2 hours once per week for 4 weeks. Third, each week in October, there will be a keynote speaker focused on a topic that amplifies the theme when racial uprising and COVID-19 collide. Unlike previous years, there is no mention of Black males or education in the theme. We made this adjustment to honor the unjustified deaths of Black people due to police brutality. Therefore, turning our attention to the ecosystem that supports, or dare we say impedes, the progress of Black males in education. We are not tone deaf and made the pivot to stand in solidarity with all movements that promote that Black lives matter. Fourth, registration for the virtual colloquium is complimentary. Thank you to the generous support of our donors and sponsors. One item we hope does not change is that the topics, speakers, and experience of the virtual colloquium sparks or reignites your interest to make a difference for Black males in education.
Hi, my name is Autumn Arnett, and I am an independent researcher on issues of equity and access in education and the author of Let's Stop Calling It an Achievement Gap. Since the spring, really, I've been consumed with a few things, but first is this idea that we're all trying to do business as usual, right? We're trying to do school, we're trying to do classes, but nothing is as usual, right? And I've been really consumed with this idea of whether Black school leaders, educators, professors, scholars have had the space that we normally would all have at the colloquium, I think, to process that, right? Like to process this idea that it's not normal, to process the idea that nothing around us is normal, that we're in the middle of a global pandemic, we're seeing what is an almost cyclical racial uprising around the country, right? As a response to the continued murder of Black men and women at the hands of police officers, and really continuing to not see any justice for those individuals. We are continuing to have to reconcile the fact that we are members of institutions that were never really created to serve us and are still proving their inability to serve us well, right? Whether students or scholars or district leaders or wherever we fall on the spectrum, we're seeing a breakdown in the systems that we were really taught to believe in, and perhaps not most of us as Black Americans, but surely as people in this country, we're seeing, again, policing fail us, we're seeing government fail us, we're seeing our elected officials not hold others accountable for the way that they've treated us, right? We're seeing the pandemic, I always point out that while the pandemic is hard for everyone, it is Black people who are disproportionately dying from the disease, right? We are seeing Black men and women, while it's Hispanic men and women who have the highest positive rates, it's Black men and women who are dying at the highest rate. So we have, we're again facing a breakdown in healthcare inequities, right? We are being faced at this moment between the pandemic, between the incidents around the country and the uprisings around the country, to again face the fact that our country is built on incredibly inequitable systems that are being, the best example that I have is like with Hurricane Katrina, right? And there have been several hurricanes before that had kind of pushed the levees, but Katrina was the one that broke it. I think that's what it feels like we are in this moment. We are seeing all of our systems that have just been pressed and pressed and pressed for generations. We're kind of seeing all of them at the same time crumble and fail to serve us well. What I think has been the great thing about the colloquium in years past, certainly since I've been attending since I think 2013 or so, is that it gave us an opportunity to A, have that space together, right? But B, realize that thanks to the global nature of the colloquium, realize that these weren't problems that we were facing in a bubble. I think that we've seen, again, with the protests in the early spring or the early summer, late spring, we saw the global nature of the protests. We saw, again, our brothers and sisters from around the globe kind of stand with us and say, America, get it together. We're not, you are not serving Black citizens well, and you are not getting it right. So I think that that is one overlap, is that we've had kind of some global recognition for the plight. I think that we are at a watershed moment in education and in a country, or as a country rather, where we're seeing really this sink or swim dilemma come up, right? Where we have a chance to completely rebuild the model that we've used, but this is the time to show and prove whether we're gonna get it right, whether we're going to make advances for Black students, right? We have a chance to completely blow up the bubble from early education all the way through and reimagine what it looks like as an industry. And I think that this is an incredibly critical moment, and I'm looking forward to the discussions and the virtual meetings at the conference this week to kind of highlight what is going on around the country, but also highlight some solutions on how we can come together.
The truth is that if you are a Black person or a minority or a poor person in many places around the world, in London, Berlin, Seoul, Cape Town, you understand what it means to be a target of the police and a target of a system that is designed to keep you down with violence if necessary.
At least 85,000 officers have been investigated or disciplined for some 200,000 incidents of alleged misconduct.
An unarmed African-American teenager was shot and killed by police in the St. Louis suburb of Ferguson,
Many
Missouri.
in the Twin Cities and around the world mourning the death of this man, George Floyd, dead after an encounter with Minneapolis police.
Demand for justice after the loss of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor. She was killed by police in her own apartment.
The responding officer didn't feel the need to do the same. And now we all know Jacob Blake's name. This didn't start with George Floyd, unfortunately. It's been around far longer than him. And if we don't do anything, this will continue.
We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality.
Good morning, and welcome to the 2020 Virtual International Colloquium on Black Males in Education. My name is LeVar J. Charleston, and I am a part of the ICBME Coordinating Committee, a clinical professor in the Department of Educational Leadership and Policy Analysis, and an associate dean in the School of Education at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I am truly honored to present our first virtual keynote speaker who will address the subject of Black and Blue, unpacking the relation of police and the Black community. Dr. Brian Williams is an associate professor of public policy in the Batten School of Leadership and Public Policy at the University of Virginia. He is the author of Citizen Perspectives on Community Policing, a case study in Athens, Georgia, is the co-author of the book Race, Policing, and Public Governance on the Other Side of Now, under contract with Cambridge University Press, and is published in leading journals in public administration, public management, community psychology, education, and police studies. He serves as the founder and director of the Public Engagement and Governance Looking, Listening, and Learning Laboratory. As a scholar committed to action research, he examines the interplay between race, policing, and public governance. His efforts are devoted to leveraging public engagement in reimagining and redesigning policies and practices that improve police-community relations. Without further ado, please welcome Dr. Brian N. Williams.
I'm Brian Williams, and it's a pleasure to speak to you this morning. Today, I'll briefly talk about Black and Blue, unpacking the relation of police and the Black community. The outline for my talk is as follows. I want to share a little bit about who I am. Then I'll kind of talk a little bit about the current state of police-community relations, how we arrived at this current state, where do we go from here, and how do we get there. So that will be the outline. In terms of who I am, my research interests kind of really connect around race, policing, and public governance. I'm really interested in the co-creation and co-production of public safety and public order and community well-being. I do a lot of work around public engagement in terms of reimagining and redesigning public safety policies, programs, professional practices, and structures. I am the founder and director of the Public Engagement and Governance Looking, Listening, and Learning Laboratory. At the core of this lab is all about race, policing, and public governance as it relates to co-creation and co-production, as it impacts this reimagining, redesigning police policies, programs, professional practices, and structures, all based upon engaging the public in policy design and kind of practice restructuring. I'm an associate professor in the Batten School of Leadership and Public Policy at the University of Virginia. You can tell that I'm an applied researcher. I'm really passionate about qualitative research. I focus a lot on engagement, trying to appreciate the lived experiences of those within law enforcement or public safety and kind of professions, but also community residents. So I'm fascinated by what does it mean to be as the question of choice. I am one who seeks to facilitate the process of getting to we. that first word of our preamble of the Constitution, I think, is crucial to forming a more perfect union. And I am one who embraces this notion of power with instead of power over, hence my emphasis being placed on co-creation and co-production that brings together those within government and non-governmental organizations with communities to kind of discuss, deliberate, and decide upon how best to produce goods, develop policies, and impact practices. The framework that I use for all of my work is a Latin phrase that basically says, let's look back at the past to understand the present in order to plan for the future. This is the framework that I'm using for this address today. And to kind of frame today's keynote address, I pull one of my favorite quotes from Ralph Ellison's book, Invisible Man. In it, he says, "I am an invisible man. No, I'm not a spook like those who haunted Edgar Allan Poe, nor am I one of your Hollywood movie ectoplasms. I'm a man of substance, of flesh and bone, fiber and liquids, and I might even be said to possess a mind. I'm invisible simply because people refuse to see me. Like the bodiless heads you see sometimes in circus sideshows, it is as though I've been surrounded by mirrors of hard, distorting glass. When they approach me, they only see my surroundings, themselves, or figments of their imagination. Indeed, everything and anything except me." I think that's a very powerful quote, and it's a fitting quote, and it's a centering quote for the address today. Let's kind of think a little bit about the precarious state of police-community relations. That's where we are right now when we think about black and blue, that relationship. So let's begin there by unpacking it. And what I do, I draw upon some data that has been analyzed by the Democracy Fund and UCLA Nationscape Project that really highlights these differences across race and ethnicity in terms of how they have a somewhat very unfavorable view of police. And what we see is that it has increased over time. So from whites, from 18% to 31%. And this time period is just a couple of weeks, from May 21st through 27th to May 28th through June 3rd of this year. So whites increased in their somewhat a very unfavorable view of police from 18% to 31%. Latinos from 25% to 36%. Asian Pacific Islanders from 18% to 44%. And Black or African Americans from 44% to 54%. So we see an increase that reflects this precarious state of police-community relations. Also, that reflects this is some data, some poll data from ABC News poll Ipsos, looking at the difference between what took place in December of 2014, highlighting the deaths of Eric Garner and Michael Brown in Ferguson, versus what took place after the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis. So we're looking at June of 2020. And the question that they asked was, do you think the recent death of George Floyd in Minneapolis is an isolated incident or a sign of broader problems in the treatment of African Americans by police? And what we see that there has been a shift in roughly 5.5 years, where the majority, 51% in 2014, considered it to be an isolated incident, while 43% saw it as a sign of a broader problem. Post George Floyd, we see things have changed dramatically. 74% see it as a sign of a broader problem, while only 26% see it as an isolated incident, again reinforcing this precarious state of police-community relations. I also pull up some Gallup poll panel data from June of 23 through July 6 of 2020, June 23rd of 2020 to July 6th of 2020. And it asked a basic question to folks by race and ethnicity. How many people, if any, do you know who personally had the following happen to them? And treated unfairly by the police, unfairly sent to jail, or stayed in jail because of lack of bail funds. Overall, U.S. adults, 41%, said some of the time treated unfairly by police. 19% unfairly sent to jail, 23% stayed in jail because of lack of bail funds. But when we really kind of take a look at it by race and ethnicity, we see that Black adults, 71% knew of people who were treated unfairly by the police, 50% knew of people who had been unfairly sent to jail, and 51% who knew of people who had stayed in jail because of lack of bail funds. Hispanic adults, 48% treated unfairly by police. They knew of someone who has been treated unfairly by police. 24% knew of someone who had been unfairly sent to jail, and 31% knew of someone who stayed in jail because of lack of bail funds. Let's compare that to white adults. 34% knew of someone who had been treated unfairly by police. 13% knew of someone who had been unfairly sent to jail, and 16% knew of someone who had stayed in jail because of lack of bail funds. So we see some differences in terms of lived experiences, in terms of appreciating, how policing and the criminal justice system impacted folks that they knew personally. If we take a deeper dive in terms of Black Americans, knowing people who are mistreated by age, we see some things that I think might be really relevant to the colloquium when we think about Black males in particular. How many people have been, do you know, who personally had the following happen to them? Treated unfairly by police? Those between the age of 18 and 41, 41% knew of someone. Those between the ages of 45 and 64, 19%, and those 65 years and older, 23%. In terms of someone being unfairly sent to jail, again, the younger demographic, 18 to 44-year-olds, 71%. 45 to 64-year-olds, 50%. 65-year-olds and older, 51%. And then finally, stayed in jail due to lack of bail money. Again, we see those between the ages of 18 and 44, 48% knew of someone personally, while those between the ages of 45 and 64, 24% knew of someone personally, and those 65 years and older, 31%. What's fascinating by these data is that the younger, it seems as if those who knew of people were greater. And this is post-segregated society when we think about those who are in the age range of 18 to 44. One would possibly expect the older to know of someone, but this seems to be flipping things up on its head a bit. All of this can impact confidence in police, and we see this through some Gallup poll data as well. When we see a gap that exists between white adults and Black adults, and this is in 2020, we see a growing gap. White adults, 56% of white adults had a great deal of quite a lot of confidence in police, while compared to 19% of Black adults had a great deal of quite a lot of confidence in police. And it seems to have had, been impacted by the type of treatment received by police, and we see this by race and ethnicity. The question that the Gallup poll panel asked June 23rd through July 6th of this year was, if you had an interaction with police in your area, how confident are you that they would treat you with courtesy and respect? Again, Black Americans had a different kind of response, a different understanding, a different sense of treatment by police. 18% felt very confident they would be treated with courtesy and respect. 43% felt somewhat confident, 27% not too confident, and 12% not at all confident. And we compare that to white Americans. 56% felt very confident that they would be treated with courtesy and respect. 35% somewhat confident, 7% not too confident, 2% not at all confident. Again, we're seeing some differences based upon race and ethnicity. All of these things seem to have an impact not only just on policing, but also on certain institutions. And the institution I'd like to focus our attention on is the criminal justice system itself. And we see how that is shaping out in terms of confidence in these institutions. White adults, 24% had a great deal of quite a lot of confidence in this institution, while only 11% of Black adults expressed a great deal of quite a lot of confidence in the criminal justice system. So we have to appreciate this growing difference in confidence in institutions between Black and white Americans. When we think about those who have a great deal of quite a lot of confidence in policing, from 1994 to 2019, we see there's been a change when compared to 2020 across white adults, but also across Black adults. As well as within the criminal justice system, there really wasn't a change for whites from 24% when we think about 1994 to 2019 to 24% in 2020. But we do see a stark change in Black adults within their confidence in the system from 21% to 11%. So the gap between 1994 and 2019 in the police, a 28% gap. While the gap between white and Black adults from 1994 to 2019 is a 3% gap. But we see this gap has grown in just 1 year. So the 2020 percentage point gap is 37% when we compare white adults to Black adults in terms of having a great deal of quite a lot of confidence in policing, and has grown to 13% when we compare white adults to Black adults in terms of having a great deal of quite a lot of confidence in the criminal justice system. All of these data highlight, once again, this precarious state, not only between police-community relations, when we think about African Americans or Blacks and policing, but also the spillover effect it seems to have had on the criminal justice system. This has called into question, this whole notion, is police reform needed? And again, I draw upon some Gallup poll data from June 23rd of 2020 to July 6th of 2020 to highlight how African Americans or Black Americans in particular, 88% say major changes are needed, while only 10% say minor changes are needed, and 2% says no changes are needed. That compares to 58%, 36%, and 6% respectively of all Americans. And when we think about white Americans, again, we see this huge difference between Black and white. 51% of white Americans say that major changes are needed. 42% say minor changes are needed, and 7% say no changes are needed. But one of the big takeaways from these data is that all Americans, a majority, 58%, see the need for police reform. So when we think about the current state of police-community relations, things are teetering a bit. Questions are being asked. Should there be a revolution or some type of evolution? Should there be riots or reforms? Should it be more protests or focusing in on progress? Should it be abolition or absolution? Should we defund or divest, or should we deconstruct and reconstruct? These are all pertinent questions that really highlight where we are right now in terms of police-community relations. So this is where we are now, but how did we get here? How did we get to this current state? And I want to spend a couple of minutes just highlighting the history of policing a bit. This is just a 30,000-foot view of it. I would encourage you to kind of take a deeper dive in appreciating how the past is impacting the present when we think about police-community relations by exploring and unpacking this whole notion of policing. But one of the things I'd like to kind of highlight is that policing in the U.S. is unique. The context of it. We have over 18,000 police departments and police agencies, if you will, when we think about those that are local, state, federal. But each policing kind of unit has its own history and culture. But they do have some common ground. They began with informal beginnings when we think about policing. A night watch, the use of volunteers, the use of militias, the use of posses, but also some of the commonality when we think about the founding or the establishment of policing within the U.S., those informal beginnings, they all kind of utilize white males. And that has been a narrative that has continued when we look at the current makeup of police organizations. Policing as an institution, both informal as well as it progressed into this kind of formal kind of notion of policing, they've always served the purpose of enforcing laws and social norms. But what has been a reality is many of those laws and social norms are reflections of social constructions or policies that targeted certain types of populations. And those populations in many instances were marginalized and stigmatized peoples and people and communities. When we think about policing, we have to appreciate the regional differences too. I've already kind of highlighted the 18,000 police departments, each with its own history and culture. But when we think about the regions of the U.S., we saw law enforcers kind of change with those regions as well. They're different within those regions. So for instance, in the South, we had slave patrols or patrollers that many would argue were the precursors of formal police agencies. And of course, those slave patrols predate the first police departments within the U.S. When we think about the slave patrols of the Carolinas, in Virginia and in Georgia. In the Northeast, we saw police organizations really kind of serve the purposes of being strike busters. Again, enforcing laws that impacted oftentimes a marginalized or stigmatized population or community, be it low-wage workers, immigrants, when we think about those within the Northeast. In the Southwest, we can kind of think about the examples of the Texas Rangers and the history of the Texas Rangers and the purpose they serve, but also some of the atrocities they committed when we think about some of the incidents of violence against those who were Native Americans, if you will, but yet the Texas Rangers enforce certain laws that impacted in a negative way those Native Americans. So when we think about police departments, we also have to kind of appreciate those responsibilities of them. Again, as I mentioned, to enforce laws including slavery and segregation, black codes, but also to protect life and liberty. But when we think about it within a Southern kind of U.S. context, the fear of runaway and freed slaves, but also the fear of Native Americans. And finally, one of the responsibilities of police departments is maintaining order, public safety and public order. And in cities and communities, especially during the time of urbanization, immigration, with the fear of immigrants and migrants, we see that they were kind of strong-armed, strong-handed in their approaches in kind of enacting, doing what they had been called to do in terms of their responsibilities. So all of this kind of sets in motion how police departments kind of evolved a bit through three eras: the political, the professional reform, and the community-oriented. But across those three eras of policing, there were gaps that existed in terms of treatment of others, primarily of the other, whoever that other might be it African Americans, those who have been enslaved, be it immigrants, be it the poor. And those are some of the challenges that we face right now in terms of this current state. So in essence, historically, what has been legal or lawful in many cases has been awful towards those stigmatized and marginalized populations. I have a slide that really highlights where we are right now and how it kind of creates some challenges for us. Is our past prologue. And what I have before me, two badges. To the left is the old runaway slave patrol badge, and to the right is much more modern deputy sheriff kind of badge. But oftentimes we think about these incidents that have taken place not only in 2020, but of course prior to 2020, across before the founding of the United States and afterwards. We really don't see a distinction many times between these two badges, which creates this tension that we're still grappling with today. So this leads to some questions of interest for me. how to be proactive in a coactive way instead of being reactive to improve the relationship between the Black community and the police departments that serve that community. That's one of the guiding questions that kind of motivates me, that inspires me, and I hope that motivates and will inspire you to consider. What are some of the pathways towards progress, and where do we go from here? So I'd like to kind of begin wrapping up my presentation by focusing in on these three questions of interest. By really kind of appreciating where do we go from here, what are the implications? And I see there are some implications for policies and professional policing practices. Now is the time for us to begin the process of reimagining public safety or community well-being. I've been fortunate to kind of facilitate and assist the mayor's office and the city of Richmond with their Reimagining Public Safety Task Force. And it's a collection of community, formal and informal leaders across the spectrum who have been taking a deep dive in appreciating the past, its impact on the present, and is in the process of making recommendations for future improvements to enhance this whole notion of community well-being, to kind of reimagine not just policing, but public safety, community safety. And we're focusing in on three primary areas: use of force policy, public safety via a human services lens, and public safety via community engagement and healing. So there are some implications for a reimagining of policies and professional practices related to public safety. There are also implications for the recruitment, selection, training, development, deployment, and sanctioning of officers, especially when we think about this whole notion of representative bureaucracy as a theory. This theory basically highlights that the more a public institution reflects the demographic makeup of the population that it serves, the better the services will be provided by that organization, if in fact those entities act upon what they represent. So if this passive dimension leads to this active kind of emphasis in terms of policies and practices. But what's troubling is that right now, 13% of officers nationwide happen to be African American. As our country continues to change, the demographics kind of shift a bit. How do we make sure that that representation is there, not only for African Americans, but also for all Americans who have different lived experiences that can bring those experiences into public service, into policymaking, into implementing those policies? What might be some unique challenges that we face when we think about the history of African Americans with policing to attract African Americans to this profession? This all kind of flows into implications for co-creating or having public engagement in policy design, especially as it relates to police practices. I refer once again to the Reimagining Public Safety Task Force in Richmond. That's a process where there's public engagement in not only thinking about policies, but also thinking about professional practices. And it's challenging kind of work because, again, we're going from this power over to this power with, where we're tapping into not only those with these who've been credentialed, but also those who have tacit knowledge, who understands what it means to be within community, what it means to be on the receiving side of disparate policing, and how they shape and craft policies and practices in conjunction with those others within the community. There's also the need to kind of co-create in public engagement in terms of training of officers. And what I mean by that is this whole notion of community academies. We're pretty familiar with citizen police academies, where police departments invite in members of the community to kind of get a sense of this is what it means to be a police officer. For the past 2 decades, I've been an advocate for what I describe as police citizen academies or community academies, where police officers are invited in by community residents, where those community residents kind of instruct those officers, this is what it means to be in this community, to live in this community. This is our history. These are the spots that we really need to work on when we think about police-community relations. But all of this requires effective management, not just public management, but also maybe community kind of management. How do you manage this process where you have those within the profession and those that profession serves kind of work in tandem to co-produce, to co-create vibrant communities, to co-produce public safety and public order. When we think about some implications too, also kind of pulled from something that Snoop Dogg sent out earlier this summer that kind of looked at, provided a comparative kind of synopsis, if you will, in terms of recruitment, selection, training, development, deployment, and sanctioning of officers. And what's really, really fascinating when we think about some of our European counterparts, what is needed to become a police officer is far greater in those countries than what's needed in the United States. In many jurisdictions within the U.S., high school diploma is appropriate, limited number of weeks of training. Some departments within the U.S. go above and beyond that, not only just the basic training, but once those officers come back to those departments, they get additional weeks and sometimes months of training. But that is not the rule. That oftentimes is the exception to the rule. But yet in some of our European counterparts, we see, like in Finland, 3-year degree is required to become a police officer. And what we can kind of infer from that, and we look at the deaths when we think about people killed by the police compared to those within the U.S. who've been killed by the police. Interesting implications in terms of where do we go from here. Other implications. I talked a little bit about this whole notion of research, representative bureaucracy, but I really want to kind of focus in on the need for more qualitative research too, and not just quantitative research, to kind of get a deeper sense of what's taking place. As I kind of framed my presentation, there are 18,000 police departments or police organizations, each with their own unique culture and history. I think it kind of sets the stage for case studies, because it's very, very difficult to generalize across these 18,000. They're so unique. Regional differences, differences in terms of tax resources to kind of support some things. There are also some implications for additional research, especially as it relates to place-based discrimination, and oftentimes how race and class is kind of bundled together in this whole notion of place-based discrimination in terms of policing. More research is needed in terms of understanding and appreciating use of force, primarily excessive use of force. This whole notion of de-escalation, the training, the effectiveness of the training, the efficacy of bias training. I know there's a lot of work that's being done around fair and impartial policing, but we need more longitudinal studies to really appreciate the impact of this type of trainings on officer behavior. One might be aware of what's taking place, but again, actions speak much louder than words or understandings. And then we need to really kind of do more research around exploring, is it the apple, the barrel, the tree, and or the soil? So more research needs to kind of focus in on the behavior of individual officers, but also thinking about organizational culture, the systemic issues when we think about the criminal justice system, but also those issues that what I consider to be the soul, those societal issues that seem to birth or to kind of bring forth some of these dystopian kind of realities that we've seen across 2020 up close and personal, but also in years and decades prior to that. There are also some implications when we think about pedagogy, especially when we think about the mission of higher ed institutions. And that mission is quite simple: to teach, to serve, and to inquire or explore into the nature of things. One thing that has been published, looking at the limited coverage or exposure to issues of bias and inequities in a lot of criminal justice texts. So those who are getting credentialed have not had enough exposure to the history of the badge, the history of the uniform, the history of those departments, the history of the profession. So there needs to be much more emphasis on doing that. Also highlighting this whole notion of administrative evil, administrative racism, and courageous fellowship. Administrative evil, where people have to understand that public organizations are human organizations, and as being human organizations, they're subjected to the realities of being human, the faults and failures, the shortcomings of humanity. This whole notion of power and grappling with hoarding power and abusing that power in terms of applying it in ways that are counterproductive to what it means to be government, to provide government services. And then this whole notion of administrative racism, that's a kind of relatively new concept that's been really written about since 2018, where we have to understand that with this administrative evil aspect, those within government oftentimes have served as functional actors, not intentional actors, but functional actors in carrying out and implementing these policies that are harmful to people of color, getting at that administrative racism kind of concept of 2018. And I see this focusing in on a need for emphasizing the concept of courageous followership, where instead of just following these orders of leaders, you begin challenging leaders in terms of what they're doing, what they're encouraging people to implement may not reflect the essence of what it means to be that organization in terms of the values of that organization. So when we think about public organizations in particular, they've kind of gone from just emphasizing efficiency and economy and effectiveness, this whole notion of equity too. And I think that requires this whole emphasis being placed on having these courageous followers who are willing to stand up to their leaders if those leaders are kind of leading the organization in a path that is counterproductive to what it means to be a public organization. Other implications, again, trying to encourage students to kind of rethink and redesign public safety in terms of the policymaking kind of courses that we teach. How do we make sure that we have our students kind of seize the day that's before us right now to kind of rethink our whole notion of the public policy making process, to really kind of emphasize public engagement in this process and help them to create or co-create these policies and practices that are much more in tune with where we are as a community, where we are as a nation. Finally, I'm a big proponent of using voices from the past to better understand the present. I am extremely grateful to the University of Virginia and the library system at the University of Virginia for having a subscription to the History Makers Digital Archive, which happens to be the largest African-American video oral history collection. And it's an untapped resource, I think, in many, many places. I would encourage your institutions to consider subscribing, and I have a link to their webpage to kind of give you more information, www.thehistorymakers.org, www.thehistorymakers.org. And it's a way to kind of really understand how the voices of the past kind of highlighted where we are right now. It's kind of almost like prophetic when you kind of go and listen to those interviews or analyze those transcripts. So we know we want to go to a better place, but how do we get there from here? To kind of wrap up, I think we have to be concerted and intentional in our efforts. And what I mean, we, researchers, public practitioners, be they police officers, policymakers, members of the mass, the attentive publics, the latent public, and others to address the implications that I've highlighted. And it begins with this whole notion of empathy, goes to sympathy, and then compassion, right? But it requires what I think this process where we begin to really kind of acknowledge pain of others, we feel the pain of others, and then we act upon that shared pain that we all have. And that leads to this, what I describe as individual and collective compassionate action, where if you see something, not only say something, but more importantly, do something, either at the individual or the collective level to address those problems that we have. So when we think about Black and Blue, kind of unpack the relationship of policing across the African-American community, I think we're at a crossroads. And I pull from an Old Testament quote from Jeremiah 6:16. It says, "Stand at the crossroads and look. Ask for the ancient paths. Ask where the good way is. and walk in it, and you will find rest for your souls. We are at a crossroads when we think about black and blue, when we think about the past and the present. And I think there's a path for us to walk in, and it is an old path, and I would encourage us to kind of think about it. So at this intersection of past and present, there's a challenge at the urgency of now. And I think Dr. King really kind of still speaks to us to really kind of accept the challenge at the urgency of now when we think about black and blue. He said, cowardice asked the question, is it safe? Expediency asked the question, is it politic? Vanity asked the question, is it popular? But conscience asked the question, is it right? And there comes a time when one must take a position that is neither safe, nor politic, nor popular, but one must take it because one's conscience tells one that it is right. We are at the urgency of now. And I would encourage each of you to take a position. That position may not be safe. It may not be politic. It may not be popular, but it is right, because we have to address these problems. The change can begin with us. I oftentimes use this kind of process to kind of think about how do we really kind of get to this whole notion of compassionate action. It begins with this whole notion of awareness, understanding, acknowledgement, and then we can get to action. So I would encourage each of you to kind of begin a campaign that's similar, making others aware of where we are, trying to make sure that they can kind of understand, even if they don't share the same lived experiences that you or I may have. And then hopefully they will acknowledge that, yes, there is a problem, much like the Gallup poll data is expressing right now. And that will allow us to kind of engage in this action at the individual and at the collective levels. I'd like to thank you for your attention. I look forward to answering any questions that you may have. Before you, I have my contact information. Feel free to give me a call on my office line, 434-243-2116. Due to COVID and some of the policies at my institution, it may take a minute for me to get back to return your call, but you can always email me at my email address. That address is bnw9q@virginia, spelled out, .edu. Again, bnw9q@virginia.edu. Thank you.
It is with great delight I get to share with everyone that Wisconsin's Equity and Inclusion Laboratory reached its 10th anniversary. Over the coming weeks and months, we will share important accomplishments across the decade. Today, I would like to share the most rewarding part of the WE Lab for me. The lab has served as a critical launch pad, not only for important ideas, but for people and their dreams. It has been a privilege to identify talented people and become a partner in their pursuit of educational and professional goals. For both current and former staff and students, I have been enriched by their contributions to the lab and their commitment to the mission. Our shared commitment and thirst to answer important questions on behalf of the vulnerable and laser-like focus to put that information in the hands of those who need it the most has created a lifelong bond anchored in that struggle. The result of that work has benefited the stature and reputation of the lab, while concurrently serving as a laboratory of learning for staff. It pleases me to see these individuals transition to graduate and professional schools, become professors and researchers, and leaders at educational institutions holding roles such as vice president and deputy athletic director. Yet some have taken their energies to work for child advocacy organizations, state government, and become CEO of meaningful nonprofits. I take this time to honor them, thank them, and commit to maintaining it as a priority that the PEGLLLab serve as a launch pad for individuals who are committed to making a difference in the lives of the vulnerable. Please be safe during these uncertain times, and thank you.
Good morning, good afternoon, depending on when you're looking at this. Thank you for participating and engaging in the ICBME virtual conference this year. Sorry we couldn't be in a physical space, but we're going to get it done just the same manner. Again, I'm Blaine Stone. I'm a third-year doctoral student at UW-Madison. I'm a research associate in the PEGLLLab, and my research interest advocates for equality and justice for former foster care youth of color as they aspire to attain post-secondary degrees.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. My name is Tiara Porter. I am a first-year doctoral student in the Educational Leadership and Policy Analysis program at UW-Madison, and I'm also a research associate in the PEGLLLab. My research focuses on mitigating institutional barriers that hinder STEM graduate student success.
Cool. So again, we want to shout out Dr. Williams. Thanks again for your presentation. So we'll just dive in a little bit, I guess, about our first reactions to viewing the presentation. I know for me, it was very enlightening. Seeing the numbers were not necessarily shocking, but to see them was very important. I think a lot of people who are going to watch this are going to see the numbers and they're going to jump out at us and just kind of remind us of what's going on and what has been going on in this country. I think things that I took away quickly are, for me, looking at the 18,000 different police departments that are in the country, but also looking at the 13% of those officers that are there identify as Black or African American. Also, the historical context behind the slave officers and how that kind of trickles down and comes to the modern day, how we see police and the issues that are being brought upon the Black community with police and just the way policing is being done in those spaces.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I think the numbers were really shocking, but at the same time, you kind of knew that it was in a really bad state. But just knowing, you know, that so many, particularly in the 18 to 44-year-old range, just are unjustly arrested and then are also kind of still pending bail. So those were just really enlightening for me. One of the things I wanted to ask or chat about was kind of where do we go from now based on Dr. Williams' presentation. And one of them was kind of reimagining public safety, right? I think one of the main ways to reimagine that is to have some sort of reform. I think kind of building off of what Blaine mentioned with just the historical standpoint of where the police system is derived from. I think that it's really critical to have an all-over reform that involves the training, that involves the development. It involves also looking at how other people and other nations and institutions are kind of handling police reform and what the training looks like there and how we can adapt that to kind of have a little bit more of the public involvement in the safety.
Right. I think, yeah, especially when he highlighted the post from Snoop Dogg about how trading is done in different countries. And when you look at how it's compared to how we do things here, it's very problematic, especially when they were looking at the number of police deaths across that spectrum that he identified. Brings a lot of just problematic concerns and issues. I think recruitment is important, but at the same time, I think more drastically needs to be done, like you said, in terms of reform. I just think it'll be difficult to kind of see what reform looks like, because I feel like bigger cities compared to smaller towns and those different types of things, it could be obviously a money issue. But if they have the money to buy militant equipment and all this other things, all these other like outlandish things they continue to buy. Why can't they put that same money and effort into reform, specifically around how to deal with diverse communities, how to deal with mental health issues and concerns and things like that. So I think it's important, but I feel like there will be, sadly, a lot of pushback.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think even if we were to begin among the many facets of the police that needs to be reformed, I think the training is one of the starting points. Kind of going off of the Snoop Dogg retweet and just showing how 2 to 3 years of training is occurring in these other places in additional to some sort of post-secondary training. And officers here only need a high school diploma and 21 weeks of training. And we also don't fully know what they're emphasizing in those 21 weeks. Is it looking at force and a lot of different physical techniques, or is it looking at how to properly de-escalate a situation, how to have conflict resolution? Is that training really rooted in enforcing power, or is it really rooted in compassion and empathy and looking at a holistic person as a human, rather than kind of this vision that police really have of just using brute force? So I guess that kind of also brings me to an interesting point of how Dr. Williams had those 3 gears to even get to compassion. You have to have a basic level of empathy, right? And what are the people that are applying to be police? What's their empathy level? Do they even have a start of it? What are the goals behind going into that to begin with? Is it based in compassion? I'm not sure.
Right. Yeah, and I think a lot of people wouldn't even know what those things are that were described in the wheel process and how they work together. Again, time and time again, we just see the Black body being controlled, being murdered and put in horrible situations due to a lot of the time a power dynamic. And it's very different when white individuals are put in that same situation. They aren't murdered. They aren't, drug across the social media platform in a bad light about prior arrest and all these other things that they have going on. So even with that, it's very problematic. And even once these things happen, how individuals from the Black community are portrayed. So.
Yeah, 100%. And it's also, 88% of Black people think that some sort of reform needs to come about because they're the ones that are being targeted. They're the ones that are having to go through these horrible, experiences. And compared to, 50% of white people think that reform needs to happen. 14% of Republicans think that reform needs to happen. And it kind of comes into play when you were mentioning what the demographic of police are, right? Like it's right. Only 13% of them are Black. And it makes me think if that were to increase and there were to be better recruitment, better retainment, and things like that, then maybe it would shift also in kind of that view and that negative connotation that's immediately associated with police amongst Black people.
Right, because I would say growing up, I think I might have known or seen like 1 or 2 police officers of color that identify as Black. Currently, since I, going to college, I know a handful of Black officers and detectives, and I talk to them often and give that kind of check in and just kind of say like, hey, how are you doing? How are you feeling about everything that's going on? Even for them, it's very problematic. But also being in that white space, how do you think they would feel about having to sit through those trainings and those different conversations that need to happen, but should officers of color also be required to be in that position?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I don't think I've ever seen a Black officer, so that's just like, I don't think I hit that 13%, but yeah, it's also, what are they feeling in that space that's predominantly for white males, right? Like, right. What is that like? And how can reform bring about a change in order to make Black people feel comfortable in that space? Is another part of kind of reimagining the where do we go from here conversation.
Right. Which kind of brings me back to Dr. Williams' presentation when he talked about the soil, the tree, the barrel, and then to the apple. I thought that was a pretty clear explanation of the way things are currently, but it also talks about the societal problems that have been the foundation of a lot of things that we see today, which also branches off into these apples. And we all know, you know, there could always be a bad apple or multiple bad apples. So it's like, okay, when we know these things are to be true, when are we going to have the ability to say, all right, we need to cut these bad apples off, or put ourselves in a position to not continuously nourish and condone these bad apples in these situations?
Yeah, that's really true too. That analogy was really powerful for me because, like you mentioned, it just shows how deep it goes. You know, you can cut a few bad apples out, but if the soil is going to continue to propagate bad apples and the tree's going to have rot, then you're kind of reform, I think, needs to go all the way down to the soil societal level, rather than just kind of like the tree level as well. So I think it's definitely requires a level of reform that would get a lot of pushback, how you mentioned. It starts so much deeper than the apples themselves too.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. It's really difficult. It's also coming all the way from the society that we live in now, outside of police brutality, but just we're living in this post-segregated society. However, the racism is really running rampant in other facets. And so if you kind of look at the soil itself, it already has tinges of racism that need to be addressed before even beginning to kind of move into these other areas. And I think that would also help with reform, is having a societal change, a different view through which we all see society, and kind of be able to pinpoint and identify those as they relate specifically to public safety reform.
Right. And I think Dr. Williams was getting to that on his one particular post where he said, where people thought the George Floyd incident was one particular incident versus now, I can't remember the other part, but it's saying that it's more of a broader, bigger spectrum of the problems that we're facing in America. So I think even in that position, you know, you're kind of highlighting exactly what he was talking about, that it's growing. More people are identifying it, but also it's just like these things have been in place forever. So it's just like now things are starting to be, more people are talking about it, but at the same time, it's just like, okay, how are we going to get over that next hump or that hurdle, like you said, to kind of start from the ground up approach and just start changing things?
Yeah, definitely. And I totally agree. I think going from, you know, a really low percentage back when, like, even going back to Ferguson and all of these things, and then now it's starting to become a prominent, like in the 70% concern, but what will it take us to get even higher than that? And I would really hope it doesn't take another isolated incident like that to get people to start to think about reforming and reimagining. One of the other things that I thought was really interesting was Dr. Williams discussed these teetering positions where you can have either this or that, or there's this / this, like protest or progress. But for me, I really think that one of those leads to another. I kind of viewed it as an if-then statement. Like, if we have protests, then protests can lead to progress. I think there has to be this like national spark and really outcry, and people that are in the positions to make these policies and have the power to do reform really need to listen to those in order to fully deconstruct and then reconstruct with all of these different aspects embedded in them. Yeah, the numbers I think were the most shocking thing for me, and also just the visual representations of how little faith and confidence and safety and trust and honesty Black people versus white people have in the criminal justice system, in the police. Just kind of showing how far those dots are apart is really showing just how much work we have to go.
Hopefully we can put in a plan of action and get there. And make it happen.
Well, thank you, Blaine, for being a part of this discussion, and I'm looking forward to hearing from our other great speakers during the colloquium.
Same. Thank you, Fatira, for joining in and dialoguing with me about Dr. Williams' presentation. I'll see you at the next one.
Greetings to all attendees at this 2020 ICBME. My name is Major General Retired Marcia Anderson. I was a member of the United States Army for over 36 years, and I have been privileged to be an attendee at this colloquium for a couple of years. I was also a presenter and a dinner speaker. And I want to just share very briefly 2 thoughts I have regarding this year's colloquium and some things I would like you to think about. As we all know, COVID-19 has had a disparate impact on our community. In particular, and my 2 issues are related to education and nutrition. The education of our children is paramount. However, in many instances, with remote learning, they have inadequate access to the internet. They live in 1 or 2 family homes, or 1 or 2 parents are working. They do not have the supervision, the bandwidth, or the freedom and space to learn as they should. And this is very concerning. We have 1 or 2 years that may be lost for some of these children. And the other issue for me is childhood nutrition. When the schools were closed, many people don't realize this deprived children, millions of children in this country. 2018 had 18 million children who were food insecure. Those children no longer had hard sites to go to for their morning breakfast. We all know breakfast is one of the most important meals of the day. And free or reduced lunch. Those sites disappeared. And although the government waived some requirements and allowed innovation with regard to how to get food to children, we know there are still families that are food insecure, that are trying to stretch juice, that are eating expired or old food, and in many cases are just skipping meals. Childhood nutrition, and I'll just say the obesity that can result from eating the wrong kinds of foods, impacts us in many ways, not just in terms of their learning, but in 5, 10, or 15 years, as a member of the military, it concerns me because it impacts our national security. Unhealthy people cannot be recruited into the military. And I, for one, want to make sure that our military represents our country, that we get our best and our brightest, and that it looks like you and me. The other issue I want to talk about briefly is the racial injustice in our country and how we are finally seeing that other people see what we experience, how it impacts us, and why it has been so important to us for all the time we've been in this country. Racial injustice can be cured. I believe that. But it's going to take a concerted effort at all levels. So I would encourage you to keep up the fight, not to get discouraged. We have to continue to educate and inform. And although it hurts us to our heart, for once in my life, we are able to educate and inform people because they see videos, they see the brutality, they see the injustice, and for once they understand what we have been complaining about all this time. So keep up the good fight, press on, don't be discouraged, and I'll simply say one of my main focuses for 2021 is that I'm going to do my best to get in some good trouble. Thank you, and God bless.
Philando Castile's murder was the tipping point for my research team. And I remember this very vividly. I walked in the lab one day in 2016 and my students were there and they looked very sad. And I asked, what's the matter? And the response was, we're tired of Black people being shot. And as a result of that, I said, well, we could do something about that. He said, what if, looking at the data, police are disproportionately stopping Blacks. Police are shooting Blacks during stops, and they say out of fear, protecting themselves, self-defense. With the proliferation of video technology on phones, we are now seeing what happens. So we're seeing things in a new perspective that we didn't have many, many years ago. with this traffic stop, could we do some things differently? Is there a way to de-escalate the traffic stop? What if we could create distance between the officer and the driver or passengers? What if we had a third party that could be engaged during the traffic stop? Would this result in a safer interaction for all involved? I suspect it would. So we started with these premises and said, could we take this and actually do something about the traffic stop? We believe this virtual traffic stop can save lives.